tired of that one?
I'm Lynn. I'm a Virgo. What are you?
I'm Alexi. I'm an Aries.
I'm Nancy, and I'm a Pisces. I'm Bobby, I'm a Libra. And then I'm an Aries.
You're what? I'm an Aries.
Aries. I'm Aries too. I'm Lisa.
I'm a Juliet and then a Cancer.
We got all, I know what you, all water and fire here. Go ahead, Gloria.
I'm Gloria and I'm a Pisces.
What else?
What else?
Okay, what do we have on this side?
Good, you're gonna balance.
What about you,
this out.
Joe? What are you?
I'm
Oh.
a Pisces.
Oh, God, Rachel.
I'm in the middle of it.
Start with me.
Sure.
I'm Gloria, and I try to be a Virgo, but I'm really a Sag.
I'm Linda. I'm a Sag.
I'm Jerry. I'm Sag.
Oh my goodness.
Same name, same sign.
Hey, what are you really?
So we,
A lot of doubling up.
That's
That's
really interesting.
Oh.
Oh, God, please turn off the light.
Or God. That's the case.
Oh, yeah, well, in Joe's case.
Yeah, right.
Joe,
Right.
we can flip that just so that it means a little bit more out there.
Kind of so goddess, isn't it? No, God.
Only
Yeah,
when
in a
I'm
way.
talking to any of you, definitely. And those over there except Joe.
Boy, do I have a lot to share with you on Egypt.
Oh, boy.
More probably than we can cover, but this is our theme for the evening. It's really, especially Egypt, from the... Much of this is almost all of it, in fact, you could historically verify through Egyptology. But it added to this are the insights of my teacher who passed away last year, Jessica Madigan, who was a vivid interpreter of the Edgar Cayce readings. So this will be drawn from the Cayce and Jessica in my
Joe?
view.
I'm doing backlighting tonight, excuses.
It's coming in.
Is it falling
So
in?
it's just going to go about 6 inches. That's all I need.
Sorry.
So, shall we begin with Egypt?
Sounds like a good place to go.
Okay. What I'd like to touch on are a number of different Egyptian cycles, starting with an ancient cycle of Egypt that goes back before Atlantis was flooded. Is there anybody here who has a lot of knowledge of Egypt, or
Raise your hand.
anybody here who feels they might have had a past life in Egypt? Just raise your hand.
Oh.
Okay.
Way
Okay,
back
so
when, the way where you're talking about, really?
Yeah.
way back. This goes way back. So we're going to touch on several of the cycles and a lot of information. I'll try to summarize. The first, in most ancient Egypt, we were looking at an indigenous native population and then the Atlanteans coming in to settle into Egypt because they knew Atlantis was going to go down. And we talked about before how they went into Persia. Even while Atlantis still was going on, they transferred some of their culture to Persia. But now they're getting to the point and they know there isn't really that much time, and so they're migrating in to live in Egypt. And so one of these, Ararat, who I believe is an Atlantean, took the rulership away from a king called Rais. And Rais was a mystic in a sense, enough that he knew intuitively that this was some kind of a karmic action that needed to happen, so he didn't really resist this. And the 16-year-old son of Ararat was set on the throne. He was called the young king. And in comes a man from the land of Zu, which must have been one of the Atlantean islands, named Ra-Ta. This man was a prophet, and he was aware that he must perfect the human body in Egypt. That was his sole purpose, because we talked about how in ancient times these creative souls had projected through their mind force into the animal kingdom, and they had created half human, half animal persons, almost like their children. And so they karmically had to come back in these bodies too, and there were still people then in the earth who had like maybe seaweed and web fingers, or could have an appendage. You read about that sometimes in wonderful magazines like The Inquirer, that like to tell us about that. So it could exist. I'm realizing I'm not going to race through this, but we have 2 Egypts, we just might have to in terms of our volume here. So in any case, Ra-Ta comes into early Egypt, and he builds 2 temples. One's called the Temple of Sacrifice, where imperfections in your human body were eradicated. And they used things like beginning chiropractic, osteopathic, homeopathic methods. They used singing and chanting. They used the medical science of the day. And what they would do, it sounds cruel in a way, but supposing you had a claw and some of your children had a claw, you would go through this healing treatment, and they might encourage you to have other children. And finally, when your children were not born with this, they treated the ones with claws nicely, but when they weren't born with this, then they felt they had succeeded in this cleansing process. And from there, you might go on to the Temple Beautiful, which was a school of prayer, meditation, astrology, the psychic arts, the arts. And it was a forerunner of some of the mystery schools that came in Greece and later on. What we're doing tonight is very much a Temple Beautiful kind of a class. We might have been priestesses of old, or everyone here may have been a priest or priestess in these temples. So Ratha's problem, though, was that he was one of those creative souls in the beginning who had both used and misused his talents. And so although he had this great spiritual power, he also could go to extremes. And he had journeyed back and forth from Atlantis. Maybe he was in an outlying island zoo, but anyway, he went into Atlantis proper and journeyed, and he really liked what they had going with their family life. There, one husband would cherish one wife instead of all the many husbands or many wives or what have you that Egypt had. So he tried to issue this edict as a priest, just like the Pope makes an edict, saying that every husband will have one wife, and this is the way it really should be. But there were certain enemies, and this whole thing on Egypt could be called Malice in the Ancient Palace, because it really gets heavy. It really gets heavy. We have inter-family marriages and everything coming up. But in any case, he tried to bring in this idea of one husband and one wife. But his enemies, who wanted to get rid of him, they're always enemies, decided that they would tempt him because he was so into perfecting the human body. They said, look, see that dancer over there? Her name was Isis. They said, she is just so beautiful and bright and everything. You're already married, but if you just have another child with her, just think how perfect it would be. And so he, being a human being, was tempted. He did it, and they had a little girl and there was he took her as a second wife and had a little girl named Iso. And there was this big furor over that. And so in heartbreak and humiliation, he and his followers were kicked out of Egypt until they were sent into exile. And they went to Africa, or the Nubian land. And the little girl was kept as a hostage, and she died. So there they met a young mystic who was a black man named Miro, or also later came to be called Hermes. And he wanted to learn from Ratha, and he wanted to help his own people. And finally, back in Egypt, there was a lot of turmoil as the native Egyptians and the Atlanteans coming in had conflict. And so Ratha was finally invited to come back to Egypt, and he brought with him Miro Hermes, or also called Thoth if you read the Egyptian texts. And he was an architect, a builder, an astrologer, astronomer. He, according to my teacher's research, was a past life of Jesus, and I believe Edgar Cayce may have verified this. So it is saying that Jesus had a past life as a black person, and we did talk last week about how we change race quite a bit. If you look at the pictures of ancient Egypt, he's depicted as an ibis-headed man. With the animal, I don't know what an ibis is, but... You want this book too?
Maybe he's in there. I think he is in there.
The reason her picture is wobbly is that I had a psychic experience after she died on Christmas Eve, which was her favorite time. I was getting ready for a class, and her picture, which had glass in it, all by itself flew across the room, and the frame broke and the glass shattered, and the Christmas tree lights were going on and off. So it's a nice broken picture, but I do have to fix it. Anyway, so this Miro or Hermes came back into Egypt, and if you read traditional Egyptology, said he ruled in the hall of judgment, and he weighed the heart of every person who had died and was going to journey into the land of death.
I'm trying to remember which book he's in. I think he's over there.
I don't even know if he was there, but there might be someone like him, And in Egypt, every god had a goddess. We talked about the twin soul concept. That was very prominent. in the Egyptian land, so that Hermes was paired with Mot, M-A-A-T, or Mot, who is the goddess of truth. And later on, after the Greeks went into Egypt, they said in their legends that Hermes was paired with Aphrodite. That looks like the right kind of energy. Maybe the one on the left, or
Now who's this again?
well, apparently in the legends, real people became thought of as, they would have animal heads, and we're just giving you a flavor of that. We don't know if that's literally that person, but a flavor of how the legends were written. So, where the Atlanteans actually had believed in one God, it was sort of a father-mother energy. We talked about that last time. One source. And the Egyptians had, you were asking Gerald last week why about all these gods that they had, and everything I read sort of answered your question. You know how the Catholics have saints?
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of saints. That was the same way they viewed their gods and goddesses, and a lot of them were based on real people who had lived in previous lives. And they would make a saint, like we have Saint Francis or Saint Teresa. It was the same kind of thing. They still sort of had a sense, though, that there was really one source, and yet they had this interest in their saints, so to speak, or their angel forces. But it was pretty strong, the multiple. So Hermes was paired with Shishita. This was his wife or goddess of writing and history, because Hermes and in reality, Hermes had a mother called the Black Madonna in Africa, and she died when he was young. When he came into Egypt, he met a woman named Shishita, married her, and they were extremely happy for about 12 years. She probably was his twin soul, who later became Mary. And it's interesting because twin souls have the same purpose in any lifetime. So where he was a writer and so forth, she was later thought of in sort of a saint-like way as the goddess of truth, and it was inspired the House of Books. But this historian Bridge writes that the Egyptians did believe in one great God, self-produced, self-existent, almighty and eternal, who greeted the gods, sun, moon, etc., and angel-type representatives. But their name for the source was something that has no name, Neter. And when Moses said, I am that I am that I am, that picks up on some of the things that the Egyptians said too. So after the death of Rata, so many people here, just a minute. It takes a Virgo to do this. I'm glad it takes a real Virgo to be willing to do this. After the death of Rata, Isis was a foster daughter of Rata, because the Egyptian believed that if a child came to you through adoption or as a foster child, it was almost as much your child as through birth, because they understood that it could have been your child in many other incarnations, and that your own would come back to you. So this was his foster daughter, ever after referred to as his daughter. And after Rata died, she became ruler with her husband named Osiris. And you've probably heard of Isis and Osiris, they're quite famous.
Mm-hmm.
And she wrote the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is, we're going to talk a lot about karma tonight, and how it's quite not good and bad. We have destiny, because here's Isis coming in as Rata's foster daughter. Well, she had been, remember there was an original ruler, Rais, and his throne was taken away from him originally. She was his, second here, I'll tell you. I will find it in a minute. But she had been Youth El Lynn, daughter of Rais, and she had begun the Book of the Dead in her past life. So now she comes back in and finds herself completing the Book of the Dead. And that's what I noticed in all this reading, is that if you started a project in one lifetime, somehow you're going to be drawn back to finish the project in another lifetime. If you were a writer before, somehow you're going to take creative writing and start all over again. It just seems to be that way. And her husband, Osiris, was kind of a nomad. And he was like, he was a nomad at heart. And he went out to civilize a lot of different lands, and he left Isis in charge with Hermes, the scribe. Hermes is still living, he's older, and he's going to be later Jesus. So he's a pretty wise soul, and he's inspiring Isis. And Rata began these changes, but Isis and Hermes carried the ideals out that started out in the Temple Beautiful and the Temple of Sacrifice. And Isis, in her writing, she tells her son Horus, in the ancient book Virgin of the World, which is a true Egyptology book, that my piles of papers out. I have to quote something. That she tells her son Horace, and you can read this, at the Rosicrucian Museum, that the soul is androgynous. She tells about twin souls, and I did stumble into the Rosicrucian Museum during the last 6 months. I have not before this been too interested in Egypt recently, but I had to go to Ram Bookstore and they were closed. I had nothing to do, and I walked in there and I found that I was just leafing around in their bookshop, and there was a book on Hermes, and it very clearly said that the creator, that he described it as a mother-father type creator, and it's right there hidden away in the. So that was nice because I was so interested in that to see, and it certainly confirms what some of this material. The only thing that Isis did wrong is that she was kind of a romantic, and so after Ratha died, she was married to this guy Osiris, and he died. I think his brother Set killed him. There's a lot of malice in the palace in Egypt. I mean, you can't turn around but it's on a cobra or something. And so, because everybody was jousting at times for the throne and the power and like this, it's interesting that no matter, even when, this is a period of kind of equal male-female power, maybe swinging a point where we're moving into more the male dominance a little bit. However, the line of the throne could only go through the woman. So you had to get the throne by being married to a sister or a daughter or whatever, and that was the only way you could get it. So she finished the Book of the Dead and so forth, and the mistake she made, though, is that she decided that Osiris, her husband who died, must be her twin soul. So she romanticized him totally out of proportion. She made a god out of this guy, and she wrote about it at great length. So that was her mistake. But now later on, these people, Isis and Osiris, are going to come back as Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and in that lifetime, they're going to really get into how they're supposed to be one god. So therefore, and it was kind of a malice in the palace is why they got on that. But the mistake they made then is that they sort of got rid of all the mysticism that they knew earlier. What it would have been good is if they could have blended them. But in this early life, they're all into reincarnation and the mysticism. So, and finally, the people jealous of Hermes and Isis decided to take their lives. And what they did to Hermes, they took him inside the Great Pyramid, they hung him upside down, and they actually crucified him, which is the same thing that happened later to Jesus. And it's interesting that Hermes lived 3 times as there were 3 different Hermes, and the last Hermes was called the Good Shepherd, which is another parallel.
So they hang him upside down, and the next time he's upside right. So he just did a whole
Kind of a reversal of that.
Reversal, yeah.
So there's something to show in your book from that.
So he lived 3 times as the same person, Hermes?
The same name.
He had this name in 3 different lifetimes.
Yeah, he did.
That's
Yeah.
interesting.
He did.
Oh,
Much of this information is drawn from the 3-volume The Past Lives of Jesus and Mary, written by Jessica Madigan, they're out of print.
Can you find the 3 Hermes?
Probably not, but they're probably there.
Yes.
That looks like a good
Because
overview.
They do mention the 3 different Hermes in here. And they
Great.
had given him credit for something like 3,000 books or something like that.
And the first Hermes said, from one soul of the universe are all souls derived. The soul passeth from body to body, and the mansions of her pilgrimage are manifold. Thou puttest off bodies as a raiment, and as vesture dost thou fold them up. Thou art from old, O Son of Man, yea, thou art from everlasting. So he did believe in reincarnation and the ancientness of our search in the earth. So, Hermes has now been crucified in the Great Pyramid, and we move into the period of the second Hermes, and this is after now Atlantis is flooded, so we're moving up in time now quite a bit, because this first period is about 10,500 BC that we just covered. And now we're moving up after the flood of Atlantis, which is the flood of Noah, and it's after this now. So, like the first and second Krishnas, remember last week we said Krishna came back a man was reincarnated 3 times. It took the name of Krishna and worked on the Vedas each time. Well, now someone else was born in the Hebrew land who, his sole purpose was to translate and revive the teachings of Hermes, the first Hermes, and to open the doors of mystery for the Jewish people, the Egyptians, the Chaldeans, the Greeks, and others. And I believe this Hermes is talked about as Melchizedek, who some of you have heard about,
Yes.
who didn't have father and he didn't have mother, he just walked in and out of the body. And many of the teachings, Josephus, the historian, writes of the teachings later of the Essenes, who helped prepare for the birth of Jesus, and they said that those teachings were based on the writings of the first Hermes in the Temple Beautiful and of Melchizedek. So what I'm seeing is there aren't all these different religions. It's been the same religion in all these different forms, building layer upon layer, and if we look at our religion today, it's really been an evolution in all its different ways, or a reaction sometimes to getting rid of something that came before. And I think Jesus said in Matthew 6:6, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet. And they believed in the Egyptian times and the Assyrian times that you should have a sacred space in your home, if not a little closet, a section of a room where you had your special things, and that you would go into this closet and do your praying and your meditating. The third Hermes comes up later, and we have so much to cover that I'm not going to do that this week, because he's a Grecian, and he helped to prepare our thinking for Plato. So, we want to do the third Hermes now? This will finish him off. He's here. Okay. The third Hermes is called Trismegistus. And he gave teachings which became the background for the Hermetic schools, and that's where Plato studied. Now, we've all had to study Plato in school, but Plato really went to the schools called the Hermetic schools based on the teachings of Hermes. And this Hermes traveled from Greece to Egypt to find out about the first Hermes, the Black Hermes, and he was welcomed by the priests because they were tuned in, and they knew this was Hermes coming back to them, and they welcomed him. He also discovered the teachings of Melchizedek, the second Hermes. When he traveled, he was called the god of wayfarers, and your road signs and everything, I guess, originated with this last Hermes. He was known as the Good Shepherd of the travelers, just as Jesus later was. And she says in her book that every one of us, possibly in the beginning of time, we chose kind of a soul pattern, like you cut out a pattern of a dress, or a design. And that's why each soul has their own individual flavor. And the one that later became Jesus was called the Way Shower, the Good Shepherd. That was his pattern. But everybody here has a certain pattern that's going to come up in their past lives. And you know it's you because you can see this pattern coming up. And he studied the temple of Diana. And now Diana, this is much later on in time, the last Hermes goes to Greece first, and he studies at the temple of Diana, but Diana was a reincarnation of Isis from Egypt.
Oh.
So he was going right, sounds like so he's going
I
right.
just understand it now, okay.
It kind of falls into place.
Yeah.
So he was returning to where his teacher of the past, and so often we are unconsciously drawn to our familiar teacher, our familiar friends, without knowing it. So, and he translated a book based on the teachings of Isis. And the third Hermes writes of the work of the first Hermes as if they're the same person without thousands of years in between them. I think there was a quote from the third Hermes. Well, I don't know what I had in mind here, but here's where it's given by the first Hermes. Let's see, first Hermes. Anyway, whatever. Apparently they are very closely linked, and I don't know why I marked that page.
I
But
have a question.
Yes,
You
go
talk
ahead.
about all these other temples. Were these temples in their minds, or were these temples previously before that they replaced with the pyramids?
The different temples I'm mentioning, these are all historical temples. The ones like the Temple of Diana later in Greece. I mean, there's suggestion of evidence of that in the. You mean like the Temple Beautiful and the Temple Sacrifice? Is that historically verifiable? That may have come through the readings of Edgar Cayce, but almost all of this I noticed is supported by historical Egyptology. But you're right, that might have come through the readings of Edgar Cayce.
It did.
And not be in traditional history. Is that your impression, Lisa?
No, I know it because I read a book about it.
Okay, so that's a good question. Some of this is supplied from what might be called the Akashic record, hopefully, that record in space and time, and the depth investigation to fill in these holes. But much of this, all of these characters are historically verifiable characters. So now we move into Egypt, back into Egypt. We were moving way ahead with that last Hermes, back into Egypt, back in time. This is the life of Khans, and Khans is apparently supposed to also be a past life of Jesus. He was a royal child, foster child of Mot, who was the wife of Amun-Ra. And where Rata was associated with the sun and Hermes Thoth was the moon, so was Khans also a moon god. Remembering the Egyptian gods are like Catholic saints. And Khans occurs after the first Hermes, after Melchizedek, and just before Joseph of the biblical period, if you're looking for a time frame. He was called the moon god. He was considered very young, very lovely. He was the navigator, or he who crosses the sky in a boat. And then this is a classical Greek tradition. The Theban trion of Amun-Ra, Mat, and himself. He is their son. He was related to healing, love energy, and youth. He was kind of like the second Krishna in India, with the dances of the youth. He appealed to them. And he died young. And he was, once a Syrian princess was ill, and he wasn't able to go to her, so they sent his divine double, which would be just like a Catholic statue. And he was healed, just the way people get healings sometimes in the Catholic she was healed by looking at the statue. It's very much like a Catholic kind of thing. So there's nothing new under the sun. Yeah. Now we're moving forward to another key personage in Egypt was Queen Hatshepsut. But before, now this is an incarnation of the same woman who had been Isis, who had raised her husband Osiris onto a pedestal. Whenever you make someone a god or a goddess, it's going to draw you back to them in another life to see them as a human being. And so in between these Egyptian periods, Isis was born into the Jewish, neat. Oh, that's beautiful and really good for maybe a good representation of something like this person we've been talking about who came back as Isis and these various other, it's lovely. So Isis passed from the body, but she came back for a time in one of the next lifetimes as Sarah, of the wife of Abraham in the Bible. So we're going to go back and forth now between Egypt and the Old Testament because they existed in parallel. Mm-hmm. And just as she had, she was then born as the Hebrew Sarah, and she couldn't have a child, remember, but she insisted that Abraham take Hagar, her Egyptian maid. And when Hagar gave birth to Isaac, Sarah first treated him as if she were the mother. But later, when Sarah, in much later age, gave birth to Isaac, she started rationalizing that it would be better if her own child, instead of Ishmael, the child of the maid, would become the predicted father to his people. So she, in an act of selfishness, she sent Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert. And this left a very deep anger on the part of Ishmael, okay? And Ishmael...
I think Sarah get married too.
The what?
I think being Sarah get married too.
It could be. Similar situation. So there was this deep anger on the part of Ishmael being sent out in the desert away from his foster mother who had seemed to accept him. Apparently, the guy who was Osiris came back as Ishmael. Now, after the life of Sarah, Sarah was reborn as Hatshepsut. And this is in the period right before Zend in Zoroastrianism. Another way of calling Hatshepsut was Hathersput or Hathor or Hathor. And those are old names for Isis. So you're right back to you get your own name back sometimes, and she rearranged in meaning. But we're gonna give you a whole series. These are a different set of characters here in some of their past lives. So Isis. So let's get this straight. So we had Isis and Osiris, who came back as Sarah and her foster son Ishmael, and now they come back again as Hatshepsut. And remember, and later on, the same guy is going to come back as Moses, way forward. And remember how Moses, when he came down from the mountain, probably with good reason, he was very angry at the golden calf. The golden calf is the representation of Isis, or Hathor. So there's a theme here that's persisting, and this anger and this rage. We talked about how did religion become quite patriarchal for a while. Moses had a lot to do with it, and he was really angry at Sarah, who had exiled him into the desert. And this is how karma gets started and gets worked out. So Sarah came back as Hatshepsut, and she was quite a strong queen. She was married to her brother, Thutmose II. This marriage, don't be shocked at this, it's going to get worse. They really believed in interfamily marriages, and there were a lot of frail and disordered people because of it, because of the genetic intermingling. So her brother Thutmose II was frail and died quite early because of this. Edgar Cayce describes her as one who ruled with might and main, yet who contributed much to the welfare of others and to those less fortunate in the material or earthly things. She had quite a bit of drive, and she also had a kindly aspect to her nature. And before her brother husband, Thutmose II, died, he had a son by his concubine, Essi or Essi. This is all historically verifiable, including Hatshepsut. And you couldn't get into the, this son couldn't get into the throne because you had to go through a female, and the concubine wasn't of royal blood. So Hatshepsut adopted him. Here he comes back again as her son, which is one of the stupidest things she ever did, because he's enraged at her unconsciously. And that's the thing, we can meet people, run into someone at the supermarket, and you don't know in that moment of meeting what hidden memories are in your aura. You talk about memories of things past, but unconsciously. And at first things went well because they had been Isis and Osiris. And
Isn't that Abraham and Moses too?
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
I can't wait until we hit the Roman period and see who they
Yeah.
become.
We keep with that.
Because he was sent off and then adopted back.
Same thing.
Yeah.
The same cast of characters, and then, and we'll get to Moses next time. But so, okay, where are we? So she's married her brother. Her brother dies early. He has this son by a concubine, and she takes him in. Being a nice person, she takes him in, which is the least she could do, having sent him out in the desert to die. So she takes him back, and her name meant highest of all the noble women. And she had a very peaceful reign. And what she did, the Egyptian people at that time have a vivid imagination and were childlike in some ways, so this book said. And so instead of getting them into a warlike quest, she decided to send out her emissaries to bring back beautiful incense trees and monkeys and create this beautiful garden. And it became a big quest. And so instead of going to war, they all went out and did this, which was really kind of bright on her part. And so she had an era of peace. And after 20 years of being close to her stepson, who she'd sort of adopted, she married him to her daughter Nefertari, and this was just the way you did it, So he became, this is all in the history books, so he became very jealous of her popularity and her friendship with a certain architect. Well, she was then beginning the Great Library of Alexandria, which did exist and was destroyed. And apparently, Cayce adds to that some of the Atlantean records may have gone to that before it was destroyed and wiped out. So she was very successful. And her stepson was called Thutmose, Thutmose III. Eventually, though, his subconscious anger came out, and he turned the priests against her. He said, well, she had all daughters, no sons, and he told the priest to forget her father's wishes, which, basically had given her this power and said that it should be hers. And I think there is an historical reference to what her father left her. He said, this is my daughter, and this is from on the walls of a monument still existing today. This is my daughter, Knem Amun Hatshepsut, who liveth, and I have appointed her. She is my successor upon the throne. She it is who shall sit upon my wonderful place. She shall command the people in every part of this place. She it is who shall lead you. But Thutmose decided to change that in some way. So her daughters were also her priestesses. And every morning they would go to the temple of the sun, and just as the sun, I guess, would sort of touch the altar, they would do their chanting and their stories and so forth. And afterwards, when the sun left the altar, then they would go off and they ran to the avenue of the Sphinx, where she had created 48 guardians of her palace with sphinx faces that looked like Isis, which was her own past life. And Thutmose, her stepson, and all his followers snuck up around her and her daughters and used the anvil of the dead, and they quickly stabbed them and killed them. And then this is historically true, he chopped up every single picture of her that existed, was carved up and hacked up, and that's all in the history books.
Chiseled them out of all the stone places they had been engraved and mounted and everything else.
How many daughters did she have? Talk about the daughters.
I know later Nefertiti has 6, but I don't recall right now. If you want to look at the break in this book, in this section, I'll show you. It should be in here, but I don't recall offhand how many daughters that she had.
Does anybody know offhand? Anybody remember offhand?
And then he went on. I guess he didn't really. He also loved her, and that's the thing. Love and hate are closely tied. So instead of wanting to face the fact that he had killed his own stepmother, who'd been his wife at other times, and all this stuff, he never thought of it again. He just went off and conquered everyone in all the surrounding areas, including the Palestinian people. He dragged them back in slaves and humiliated them. So this is very important to remember. Thutmose III enslaved the Jewish people for the first time as an Egyptian. He is the man who became Moses. And what did Moses have to do? He had to take them
Yeah,
out.
exactly.
Set them
You know,
up, yeah.
so,
Alright.
so you kind of have to clean up what you start. That's the thing with karma. So then, okay, now we get in this final period that there was a whole book that read more like a novel on this, and I just sort of tried to extrapolate the highlights of this story. And this is a story of the period of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Aye. So as Akhenaten carried out enslaving the Hebrews, he became in his soul kind of sick with conquest, and when he died, he was reborn again as Akhenaten. But where he had enslaved everybody else, he came back because of this intermarrying in a sort of a handicapped body that was misshapen. And you see the pictures of Akhenaten. He has a very protruding stomach. There was something not quite right about him physically, and that's what the Egyptologists feel. And it was due, no doubt, to the intermarrying and the intermingling that had happened. So he is believed by Egyptologists historically to be one of the greatest pharaohs, because somehow out of this time did emerge the concept of the one God, which, whatever. But he decided to call his misshapen body godlike, that only a god could have a body like that. So he made a cult out of it, that his body was divine. And all the pharaohs believed that they were immortal. I mean, that they didn't die easily and this kind of thing. But he actually started believing he was this one god after a time. So this story starts out on Nefertiti and Akhenaten with the pharaoh Amenhotep III, who had, remember Abraham, the husband of Sarah, what happened to him? He came back as Amenhotep later, and he was also the father of Khans. And he was basically had been a good pharaoh in the past, but he'd exiled others. And of course, karma can reach back to you. And he married a woman named Tai. She was quite charming and quite strong-minded, and she was the grandchild of the slaves that Thutmose had taken. Should we pause and get this all in? So here's this guy Thutmose. He dies enslaving everybody, and now we have a new life, and there's a man, Amenhotep III, who had been the father of this other guy we've been watching in a different lifetime, in the Jewish time. And he marries a woman who's been, her family's been a slave, and she's bitter at this enslavement right from the word go. So out of this marriage came, I made a mistake.
No.
Don't do that,
No.
Liz. What are you talking about?
Okay, he did marry her, but first, there was something else. She was married to her brother first. That's how they normally do it. Tai and I got married. T-I-Y-E and A-Y-E were married. And out of this came twins, Akhenaten and Nefertiti. They were the twin boy and girl from their brother and sister parents, and they were from a long line of brothers and sisters, and that is why Akhenaten did not come out right, because there was so much genetic inbreeding that they were getting deformities and stuff. And so, to make it even more complicated, but then Amenhotep is the pharaoh, and he's looking at this Ai and Tai, and he finds Tai pretty attractive, and he would like to marry Tai. So he convinces Ai, who was really a good person. This guy Ai had been Rata, the high priest of Egypt, before. He was kind of a mystic and kind of wise, and he sort of allowed this to happen because he felt it was a karmic thing again. And so Nefertiti and Akhenaten got a stepfather called Amenhotep, who was basically a good pharaoh. And the mother, Tai, married to Amenhotep, determined, since her grandparents were slaves, she said, this is a great opportunity. I want my son to become the pharaoh, eventually. And later on, Tai and Amenhotep had their own child. But he was partly Egyptian in her mind, and she wanted her first son by her brother to become the one. And Amenhotep was pretty happy that he had a child, but he allowed Tai, who was very outspoken, to engineer this. And so Akhenaten, who was misshapen, was sent away for a while. And in the meantime, Nefertiti she remained close to her natural father, Ai. He was kind of a mentor to her. And remember, Ai had been Rata, and his karma was he was the one that convinced that king that he should marry his sweetheart. And that was the dance. Remember, he was the one that had the affair and had the dance. It's kind of the Jim Baker of his time. Or the Gary Hart. And he was sent out because of that. So now in this life, he was wise enough to know when the king says, I want your sister wife, who he actually loved. She saw him as a brother, but he was actually in love because that was the thing they did then. And the king said, I want her. And he knew this was karma because he had taken that dancer was the girlfriend of the king way back, that he had wanted her, and he'd had a big problem. So he sort of stepped aside, and that's how it turned out. And anyway, this woman Tai, the slave married now to the king, had the second son Smenkari. This is all historically true, but of course she didn't want him to rule. And the disease from the intermarrying was called the disease of the madness of the Matanis, and it was the result of the brother and sister stuff. And what happened is by the time you hit about 40, you went blind and you went berserk. And so it really wasn't a very happy thing. You lost your faculties at about that age. So it was not a very happy thing to look forward to. But for a while, things were okay.
Kind of like Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
It's amazing that
Or AIDS.
Yeah.
We all try to be one, and then it's like we didn't want to be part of one another through this. That we wanted to separate somehow because of the sickness and the.
It didn't work out in the physical.
No, it sure didn't.
The spirit's great.
Oneness means in the physical.
Who'd been Rata, who's now his sister wife has been taken from him. He was pretty wise, and he functioned as kind of a priestly role in this whole era. And he helped build another similar lovely garden for his sister Tai, even though she was taken from him. He accepted his loss as karmic. And Amenhotep, the king, tried to give him another wife, whom they named Te, who looked just like the first wife, but it wasn't really the same. But he did allow Ai to have a lot of time with his natural daughter Nefertiti, and they were very close. And he'd already dreamed that Nefertiti and Akhenaten were his children, so to speak, from Egypt, Isis and Osiris. So he really understood what was going on the soul level. And he knew that Isis had made her husband then Osiris a god after his death. And as well as doing the good things that she did, like working on the Book of the Dead and making sure that no child in Egypt starved by the wayside or was put to death. She was kind of like a Mother Teresa in a way, in her rulership. And so now I and his new wife Te have a daughter named Nezamut, and she had a past life as Nephthys, sister of Isis. So I'm sure this is all a lot, but maybe it's something to absorb if you get more deeply into this history. So finally Akhenaten is brought back to the palace, and Amenhotep does put him on the throne. And the reason on a soul level that he probably did this is that he had been Abraham of the Bible, and he was the one who let his wife send Ishmael into the desert. So now he has to take his stepson, even though he has his own child, and what does he have to do? He has to put Ishmael back as number one, and that's just how it always works. So he put Akhenaten on the throne, probably having a few misgivings because the madness of Mitanni was starting to show, but he had to do it for some reason, so he did it. And he was a very great, Amenhotep was a great and strong man, but she says in her book that a lot of times people who are very great hide some inner weakness with this strength, and he feared pain. And about this time in his life, he developed something, probably they were like terrible abscesses, but they weren't able to heal them in the same way. And so he started to drink to escape this and go off on hunting trips, and that left Akhenaten more and more in charge, the stepson. Now, Akhenaten's mother, Tai, was pretty ambitious, and she had, because she was the granddaughter of a slave, the thing then was they all worshipped Amun-Ra. And I guess Amun-Ra, in a way, it's more like worshipping a saint. It's like kind of a past life, but that was the way they saw God at that time. And they allowed room for a lot of goddesses and gods and kind of other images, including Mot, the goddess of truth. And Tai wanted to get involved in one of those festivals. She wanted to, but they didn't want her to be because she was the granddaughter of a slave, and she never forgot that. So she, not because of being so religious, she started influencing her son to move to this new god, Aten, who they ended up calling the one god. And she pushed him to do it just for political reasons. Well, when Amenhotep was away, out on the hunt and having tooth problems or whatever, he came back and he was really angry at Akhenaten for getting rid of their form of worship. And so he said he was going to exile him. And that clicked back in the mind of Ishmael, and that was all it took. He was a weak man, Akhenaten, but he had made up for it by taking something kind of like karate. And with one move, he split his stepfather's back, and that was it. And there are pictures in Egyptology. After that, Amenhotep is in, one time he's dressed in the garb of a woman or a priest, and they said that that's partly because they had to hold him up, to cover up this disability. So Amenhotep became paralyzed, and when he started to yell, Akhenaten gave him another chop, and he lost his voice. So he just went around and told everyone that his dad had a stroke. Not too nice. So it gets worse. And so then finally Tai got her wish. Her son would rule, but she basically was good underneath, and she grieved a lot because she had loved Amenhotep, and she was a very passionate woman, and their whole life was destroyed, and yet she remained loyal to him because she in a past life had been, when he was Abraham, she had yet been his mother, so she ended up mothering him all over again the rest of his life. And
Do they know the length of his life? Do they have an idea?
I didn't read it in here, but it's probably available. And some of like the ends of exactly what happened come from her psychic research, but much of the outer comes from the Egyptology. And I don't know how long he lived, but it was a while. So that certainly sets up a karma for Akhenaten right off the bat doing that.
Have you ever read anything on Genghis Khan? It's almost like the same story all over again.
Interesting.
The mother and the mother was in love with the brother, and the brother was a wise and holy man.
Really?
And she was stolen by this king, was the possessor, and the brother came along and was a
Interesting.
politician and worked his way into the tribe. And
You might be getting another past life
Yes.
as he's saying the same
There's some
crowd.
I
Roman
love
era
this,
energy, too.
and he sees this dance hall girl or
Mhm.
beautiful woman, and he's already married somebody else, and she kills herself, and he goes off and conquers the whole world. So it's like,
Sounds very similar in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how else would you get that job, you know? You had to come from somewhere.
It had to come from a karmic thing.
Exactly.
She says in her book, and I
Yeah.
thought every once in a while she interjects a little bit of wisdom, and I thought she said in her research there are 36 stories in essence, variations on which a theme we can live. Boy meets girl, other boy meets girl, boy takes girl away. I mean, there's about
boy
30.
meets boy, girl meets girl.
Boy meets boy, girl meets girl. You know,
Boy
there's
meets girl and girl.
Right. But there's about 36 basic patterns, she said, and that psychological patterns, and of course they have been played out in hundreds of individual ways, but we see these patterns repeating, these archetypal patterns repeating through time. Okay, so where are we now? So now he got the throne away from Amenhotep. Now later, when he becomes Moses, he never could really rule in Egypt, but the only time he could really rule was in his long trek across the desert. Anyway, at this point, Akhenaten tries to destroy the belief in reincarnation because he is jealous because his stepfather, Amenhotep, he had had a past life as Amen, and so he was kind of jealous of him in the first place, and so he shifted over to the worship of Aten, kind of for political reasons. And then she says in the book, was this the madness of Mitanni beginning? So, or maybe I said that, but I think it was at this point.
What does Mitanni come from? What does Mitanni mean?
Mitanni was a strain of the Egyptian people, and this woman Tai came from the Mitanni strain. That was a type of Egyptian. You know, it was a certain sect or a certain, and a lot of the brother-sister marriages, I guess, occurred in the Mitannis as a whole. Some that were in the throne, some that were not. So now we come to Nefertiti and Akhenaten, and they are, remember, the twin brother and sister of Ai and Tai, and at this point, the custom for the pharaoh was that the pharaoh would take many wives. I mean, they were brought in droves, and he might see the wife for about 10 minutes once in his whole life, and that's it. I mean, it wasn't always a full-blown relationship, but it was kind of a political move. And Nefertiti was made the great wife of Akhenaten, so she married her brother Akhenaten, which is very acceptable in this time. But she went on to help the other wives in the House of Women, just as you might go to work at Good Samaritan Hospital as a volunteer or something. It was like a charitable work that she did. So she was kind of a great mother to these others. And she had 6 daughters and 1 son, Tutankhaten. Akhenaten functioned strangely in love due to his illness, and he often wanted his sister wife, she says, to play his part. In many ways he wished he could be her, and he was really jealous that she could be pregnant and not him.
There's a transvestite.
He could have been, in a sense, you know, among other things that he was working out. And so this was her, but this is a lot of her karma, because when they had been married as Isis and Osiris, she made him a god. She wrote about it constantly, and now here she's seeing him, and she's still idealizing him, but he definitely has some problems. And I, the priest, who was Rata before, the wise person, said to try to look to their greater purpose and not ask of Akhenaten what he could not give. Now, I a lot of times tells her to put up with a lot of stuff, and I'm not sure he was completely right, but that was his wise counsel. So at this point, many people in Egypt wanted to turn back. He brought in this new god, this one god, and so forth, and they were more comfortable with with their saints of the past, their gods and goddesses of old. For example, women in childbirth, they wanted to still think about Isis because it was Akhenaten who turned this new god Aten into a more completely masculine image. You know, he made it more into just the masculine, and a lot of them couldn't identify anymore with what they had had before. And so Akhenaten, he feared death, he feared darkness, and every corner of the palace had to be kept in light at this point. Like all pharaohs, he believed himself immortal, but Akhenaten also thought that he was Aten, this one god. And Amenhotep, who's been crippled by him, his eyes seem to keep speaking to Nefertiti and wanting to tell her or communicate something to her. But she doesn't know what it is. It's like some warning. Possibly her stepfather and Nefertiti were really twin souls underneath from their past lives as Sarah and Abraham or whatever. And I keeps telling her to hold back and she was kind of the brighter of the two of them, but to be more submissive to the wishes of Akhenaten. It's sort of play the game, this is a karmic thing, you know, and try to look to the overall good. And in the 9th year of his reign, then Akhenaten took Nefertiti's sister Nezamut, as the laughing one, as one of his wives. And apparently Nefertiti was close to her sister, and she hoped that some of the great joy of Nezamut would transfer to Akhenaten because he was getting more and more melancholy and depressed. His mother was still a dominant force in his life, and even the children that they had, these daughters and this son, seemed to turn more to the Queen Mother in a lot of ways, but some of the daughters. And so, but Tai, the Queen Mother, being so aggressive and a little bit too strong a force over Nefertiti's life, this would be her karma as Hatshepsut, when Nefertiti herself had been Hatshepsut, who was a very good ruler, but very, forceful, and maybe she was meeting a little karma there with Tai. And so finally who is this wise priestly type person, the father of Nefertiti, predicts to her that Hermes they're going to have a son. They've had daughters up to this point, and she's very close to them, but they say that she will have a son named Hermes, who has been Hermes before. And this one night, for some reason, in the story, whether this is true or not, Akhenaten seemed to sort of become a different person and be more like his past lives, and they had a nice night for a change. And out of this, they had a vision in which they saw the light of, when they went to their temple of Aten. Now, Aten is the new god, the one god that they've come up with. But was wise. He let Akhenaten have one part of the temple for sort of a masculine view of it, and Nefertiti for the feminine image or the father-mother aspect. So they were integrating, the Atlantean concept here. And she had a vision of the sun, the same thing when the sun was on the altar. She saw it just flood over her, and she suddenly seemed to know all the mysteries of the ages. And so they had a special feeling about this one son. They also had a daughter named Mekheton, who it turns out was probably the twin soul of the son that they have, Tutankhaten, and that was the little King Tut, whose tomb was open. Tutankhaten. And Jessica's feeling was that when the tomb of King Tut was opened, it meant so much to people because subconsciously there was the memory that this child had been this special soul who had incarnated in other times in other places. Whether that's true or not is for your thought. And by now their city was called the City of the Sun, or Tel El Amarna. And they would have sunrises ceremonies with priests and priestesses in these two temples. And they used ancient robes with the colors from the Temple of Beauty. And those colors were, Lexi's wearing them. It was the lavender and the white linen and threads of gold. And that was the colors that they used.
Oh, I forgot my gold.
You've got the jewelry.
This wasn't intentionally, by the way. Lynn told me earlier that I had them.
Only after you had them.
Yeah.
So finally, Mekheton, who was the twin soul of little King Tut, died early. And when she died, Akhenaten could not handle death because he was supposed to be immortal. So he sank into an even deeper depression and almost manic activity. On the outside, he could be quite polished, and he could intuitively know the right words to speak to an individual, conveying an understanding he did not really possess. And lands became lost by his mishandling. People would come to court and ask him about this problem and that problem, and he was just too, out of it at this point to really do much about it. And now he became more and more mad, and he threatened Nefertiti to make one of their daughters his great wife, and doing so publicly in a great ceremony. In doing that, he repaid Nefertiti for 1,000 things. And the author says maybe for being more beautiful, and he wished he looked like her, that she could have children. She was somewhat brighter, and I think really what he was paying her back for was deep down the rage of Ishmael, who'd gone into the desert. So he was really becoming mad. And he also turned to his half-brother, Smen-Kari. He was really more in love with his brother than anyone else. And in taking the daughters, he took 2 of them to wife. These were daughters that were going to marry his brother, and it was like he wanted everything. He wanted to be one with his brother. So it was getting to be a pretty sick trip. I mean, here, you know, Parents United would be rushing over to the palace and say, no, you know. But apparently these marriages didn't, last but a day, as horrible as they were. And I think wrongly, kept telling Nefertiti, you know, go with us, we have to, you know, what can we do? But Egyptologists did find a sunshade centuries later, and it said, it was reading that this sunshade, I guess, is something that they used in the funereal ceremonies, but it said that this was for the daughter of Akhenaten by his daughter, Ankhesenpaten. The child was stillborn. So, I mean, this is verified in Egyptian history that he actually did this. And now he didn't even want light in the palace, he wanted complete darkness everywhere. He put drapes over all the windows and so forth. And cities became plundered, he would give no help. He was so mad now that his great wife was his half-brother and his daughter. And she says he really psychologically took his daughter because she was to be the wife of his half-brother whom he wanted to possess in every way. And the same thing with the other daughter who was only a child, that he did the same thing. So at this point his mother, Tai, has had enough, and she suddenly wants to return the people to the worship of the former gods that they have. But Nefertiti now really believes in this concept of a one god, and she will not give up this. And she feels that her little son, King Tut, is somehow associated in a special way with this one god, and so she does not want to give this up. And by the way, how do you pronounce it correctly? Tutankhamun. Looks just like Khan's, which is probably a former incarnation of his. But even I tells her now that she should go along with these priests who want to take back their worship. He says, do this on the surface. I mean, you can worship whatever you feel, but do this because otherwise they're going to turn on her son, and so forth. But she won't do this. And Akhenaten he's turned away from that god that he wanted because his children had died, and Aten didn't give him immortality, so he turned away and he became bitter. Now this brother, who is hanging out with his brother, Smen-Kari, warns Nefertiti that Akhenaten is enraged at her. She ignores him, and he too becomes bitter at her and shrinks away. Don't want her to miss the exciting point. Malice in the palace. So finally, Akhenaten persuades his sister Nefertiti to go with him by chariot to the tombs in the eastern mountains where their daughter Mekhetan is buried. And she thinks, finally, all this hell is over. We're going to be close again as we were when we were young. And so she gets in the chariot and goes. And while she's visiting the tombs, and everything seems fine, he quotes all this loving poetry to her in sort of a manic kind of a way. And then all of a sudden, they had these red-hot tapers that were used as part of the to entomb the dead or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so he grabs it all of a sudden, and the half-brother Smen-Kari sneaks out of the shadows, and they throw her to her knees, push her head back, and they gouge out her left eye, which is not too good. She screams and she falls into a coma. And at that point, and you'll notice if you see the bust that survived of Nefertiti, that eye, there's something very strange about that eye. Her father Ai discovered her much later at the sacred tomb. Because he had been Rata before, greatest healer of the earliest period of Egypt, he was able to save her remaining eye, but she always did have a mist because of the one that was gone. There was a mist over her vision, but he did save her eyesight, and he healed her. And they decided that together, she and her father Ai must mentor and protect her son, Tutankhaten, just as Hermes, he was a past life of Hermes, had mentored them. Now Smen-Kari, the sneaky half-brother, becomes co-pharaoh, and their mother, Tai, is crushed, and she loses all of her physical strength and health, but she can't control Smen-Kari. And just as Thutmose III had conquered all those people, like the Jewish people, now he became Akhenaten, and now Akhenaten is completely conquered by this madness and this deformity in his own body. And Tai, and then comes in this peasant general, Horemheb, who wants to kill Akhenaten, and his own mother Tai, at this point, is for it in some ways. And Horemheb sends cobras first to kill Smen-Kari, and then to kill, Akhenaten also gets they think, and this is from the Akashic record, gets turned upside down, kind of crucified over a burning pot, and when he starts to yell, someone does the same thing to him that happened to his father, and then his body is dropped beneath the Nile. And this last part of exactly what happened did come from psychic research, this last chunk. So, okay, and we get near the end of this. So now, Tutankhamun must become pharaoh and a son of Amun-Ra to be kept to preserve his life. But and King Tut does keep in his young rulership Aten as the one god still, in the best way that he can. The court of the sun is moved to Thebes after Tai's death, and I didn't have time to type this, so bear with me here. In order to preserve this little King Tut, even Queen Tai suggests to Nefertiti that they start new rumors that he's not really the son of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, but rather the son of Tai and her husband Amenhotep, and that's why they think that there's conflict in the Egyptologists about whose son he really was. But that was to protect him. But under the tutelage of young King Tut was a king of peace, a friend of the Nubians. He journeyed back to the Sphinx, and he was very interested in the life of the first Hermes, whom he had been. And so Egypt reigned again for a while in her past glory. His sisters, fortunately, after all the terrible things that had happened to them, they got to be married off to foreign princes, out of the family at last. And so that was a plus for them. And his wife, Ankhis, which was a sister, Ankhisen as Patton, who had to give birth to two stillborn infants because of this intermarrying and so forth. Now Horemheb, this evil general, wants to marry her, to her horror, and but he also wants to marry her mother Nefertiti. And he goes to have an audience with her, and Nefertiti, I think, is thinking of doing it just to protect her daughter, but she can't. Because he's murdered her brothers, as bad as they were. She calls him a beggar boy who'd killed her two brothers. And now he decides that he must become pharaoh and bring her to doom, and he does in recorded history become pharaoh for a while. And apparently Horemheb, according to this research, later became Julius Caesar, and Julius Caesar was felled by the knives of priests, just as Horemheb in this lifetime got everybody killed off with knives, and he does a bit of knifing. So, and this gets even stranger. If you look at Egypt, the Egyptologists uncovered something in the same time period, and it just horrified them. They mentioned that had married his granddaughter, and that was just beyond belief to them. But apparently, according to this, married his granddaughter to protect her from being with Horemheb, and it was only a name. He never married her in any other sense, because he was a mystic and certainly not given to the same illnesses as Akhenaten. And finally, reigned, and this girl, Akhenaten, is called, in true Egyptology, the thrice queen, because she was married first to Father Akhenaten, and then to her brother Tutankhamun, and then to her grandfather So it's really malice in the palace, but never married her in that sense. He married her to protect her from Horemheb. And in her last portrait that was ever done of her, there's a story at the end of this book that's kind of interesting. Nefertiti knows that Horemheb is going to sweep in and take over everything, and so she tries to preserve some statues and likenesses of herself and her family. And because Horemheb was he was out to crucify her too, literally. And he heard that she had died of the coughing sickness, and he went, whether that was a rumor or not at this point was uncertain, but he went through and destroyed all the burial temples that he could find in that part of Egypt to try to unearth her body and destroy it. And they do write about why during that period they can't find much of the remnants of the people that they know existed, and they know someone destroyed all the burial temples. But in her last hour, apparently, and this is from Akashic record research, she dreamed that she was in the temple of Aten again. She had the coughing sickness. And she was back in that temple, and as the rays of the sun flooded the altar, the two individuals she had loved most came to her, and little King Tut, and she went with them joyously into the sacred land of the dead. Edgar Cayce called Nefertiti, Akhenaten, and initiates of the one God. So through all of this stuff that they did, out came another form of religion and religious expression. And I thought that in her last portrait, Nefertiti put on, as an impulse, the crown of Isis, the quarter moon, or the horns of Hathor. And I just thought, we're done now, but read to you just a little bit of the last page of this book. There had been a sculptor also called Thutmose, a different Thutmose. I really like the same name. And he had always kind of had a crush on Nefertiti, and toward the end of her life, they did do a bust. She and her sister came in, and the Egyptologists aren't sure which, if it was Nezamut or Nefertiti, one of the busts. But anyway, they came in and they had this done, and at first, he made it perfect. Her eye was clouded, like cataract-like, but he made it perfect because the queen is like a goddess, and you don't tamper with that. And so, but anyway, as Horemheb came into the city, he had the presence of mind to throw out all the other busts of her where they could find them and destroy them. But he buried one really deep in the sand, and that's the one that we have that survived. Only when he buried it with the eyes perfect. Anyway, this is the last page of this book. Aftermath. 30 years after the death of Nefertiti, a small but well-equipped Egyptian barge drew up alongside one of the cracked quays that had once served the port of Akhenaten. A gray-haired elderly man embarked and made his way, slowly but determinedly, to a certain quarter of the once beautiful city. As he walked in the hot sun, the only movement was the shifting of the sands against that which was now ruin and desolation. As memory upon memory poured in upon him, he saw again the pageantry and splendor of that which had once been. The great temple of the Sun Palace, column upon majestic column, took semblance before his eyes. He saw the gardens, the fountains, the high balconies, where once a king and queen accepted the homage of their people. He remembered the golden son of the sun, Tutankhaten, in his shining chariot, outdistancing even the fastest of the nobles. Somewhere in time he knew that this city lay unchanged for all eternity. It was said that there was a heavenly book, a book of memory, where all might relive and know the past. As tears streamed down his cheeks, he knew that he too had opened this book where all things are as they once were, where a radiant queen, beautiful and dignified even in sorrow and aloneness, remains faithful to an ideal. He thought of the name by which she was now known, Heretic, she and her brother husband Akhenaten, and even I, the old wise one. He remembered, too, the other name by which they had been called, beloved of Aten. They had been young when he had been young. It had seemed then that this one life must last forever. But one by one he had seen them go into the sacred land, the land of no return. Even the young prince, he, whom his mother believed to have been Hermes, was no longer, nor were his sisters. Were they shadows upon the skein of time, or did they move and breathe forever in that sacred land? He did not know. He knew only that his own time was short, and he must accomplish that which he had come to do. At last he arrived at the street of the sculptors, at that which had once been his own villa, and which had been called the House of Sculptors. Even those students who had been faithful to the last had now died. It was as if he, Thutmose, was the only living person of that time and place, Thutmose the sculptor here. Horemheb, the commoner who had ruled Egypt in the days of its decline, had relinquished his place at the court, where death had come even to him, the strong in battle. And to Nezamut, the sister of the one whom Thutmose had loved, she had died broken-heartedly, they said, years before. Once within his studio, he remembered each hiding place for those of the family of Nefertiti, her brother husband Akhenaten. The head he lifted slowly from the sands where he had placed it, a statue of Nezamut which resembled Nefertiti greatly, the torso he had done long ago, the faces of her children, her father Ai. With many tears he took them from their hiding places and set them in the niches which he had prepared for them. When all the others once again graced his studios, he brushed aside the sands where she lay hidden, the lady he had loved so long ago, the lady of the sun, she Nefertiti, queen of Egypt, high priestess of the one god Aten. One day all of these, even she, would be discovered, he believed, but it was not to be until 1912 that the Deutsche Orient Gesellschaft was to discover the house of Thutmose the sculptor, and lying in the dust from where it had fallen from a high shelf, the bust of Nefertiti. So that was the end of the book. And he did finally, before, apparently he did alter the eye, which was the way that some of the story could emerge of what had happened to her.
Anybody have any comments on how they were feeling about that? Did it hit any inner cores? Anybody want to share anything? Anybody want a cup of coffee or a cup of tea?
See, it just seems like there's nothing new.
Not really.
Over and over. It's like,
It's
when you're talking about all the
universal
kills,
self,
these kings being killed, it's like I wondered who the Kennedys were.
Yeah.
Which ones? You
It's
know?
really interesting because when Jessica first got into this, I think she at first thought that that Jacqueline, John Kennedy, and the brothers might have been like an Isis-Osiris type pattern. And she later felt that they weren't those specific people, but she did point out that there were about 3,000 unnamed kings in Egypt. If you figure that each one of them could have had 5 wives, that makes a lot of potential Isises and Osirises, so she figured it was a similar pattern, but that these were a particular different set of individuals who went on into the Holy Land and like that. I guess if you take any of ourselves or any of key figures in history, you can make these thread connections, and it's really exciting when you start to do it for yourself, and you just come upon a past life. Historically, it doesn't have to be the most famous person in the world. One of the ones I found for myself through a dream that was a real person was the 4th daughter of a prominent political philosopher who translated a few books, and I don't think anyone of you would know her name, but something led me to her, and I do know it's me because she had some of the same strengths and weaknesses.
There's a writer who wrote in the 18th century, and I just lost her name. What's her name?
George Sand or George
No.
Eliot or
No, Corey, started with a C.
not Colette, who's more recent.
No. She writes it's like romantic novels that were written in the 18th century, early 18th century, about past lives and reincarnation.
Really?
And she ties in. I had a number of books, and they're
Oh,
kind of.
Taylor Caldwell.
Nope.
No?
Taylor Caldwell
That's
wrote
probably
it.
her reincarnation.
No, she
She's 18th century. So
18th century.
Oh.
And I'll think of her name, but I've read some of her books, and she gets into all of this kind of. But it's very romantic, and she was not well accepted at all.
Oh, I can
Interesting.
imagine.
Interesting. So you seem to repeat your pattern, or you'll swing to the opposite. If you were, you kind of go to the extremes, or you repeat, but you're still working out the same karmic threads. And karma isn't really all bad. I mean, you see these people were trying to put out a destiny, and they also made some mistakes, which would be their negative karma, and plus their soul destiny and their positive karma.
I know we really tried with the Greeks a lot, though, too.
The Egyptians.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was feeling. I was like, well, and then when you pointed to that goddess of Isis with Diana, I was like, oh.
That's what we're gonna do.
Yeah. I'd like to share something. This picture of the Sphinx in the pyramid is beginning to crumble, which probably resembles much of this, was done by Anna, and she
Beautiful.
did 2 or 3 or 4. She was doing.
I don't
each
ha-
one
I don't
was a
have-
little different
Really,
remembrance.
I
I thought,
Beautiful.
because she had different feeling in each one that I saw.
Maybe you were an Egyptian
Well,
artist.
Yeah.
well, it's really
Yeah.
interesting because I keep, in my art classes that I just started, I kept drawing pyramids, and my art teacher would go, "This is really boring, Anna." You keep
For him, he
leaving,
never
you keep
lived it.
leaving in these notes in my portfolio saying, let's try a different subject. I mean,
Just
over and over,
prejudice, yeah.
and I kept going back to it. So, she picks this up for me the other day, and 9 years we've never argued ever over a thing. She had one end of the portfolio, and I had the other end of it. And it was really weird. We were standing in my salon, and she goes, "You do this for me?" And I went, "No." And I pulled on it. It's like I wouldn't let go. And she pulled back the other way. "No, this belongs to me." And I pulled back the other way, going, "No." And we were eye to eye. It was like, who was going to win on this thing?
You might have been sisters in that
Oh,
time.
It was
Like,
it was so funny, and I
Yeah.
finally let go of it. And it was like, today at work, I went, "What did I get that back?" And it's like, I can't, it's never going to go back to me.
It's going. Oh yes, it was.
Some
Going
year-
house to house.
But
We
it
have a
was
lot
the
of our work
strangest
that
thing
goes back and
because
forth
we never
between us.
argued over anything. We've always just exchanged it. She had one end and I had another, and we both had tug on it. She hadn't even seen it yet.
Mhm.
It was really a fun experience. But I've done about
Beautiful.
8 sets of
Beautiful for a
pyramids.
new artist. I mean, it's
She
just so well
had
done.
done one. I
It
never
could
got
be.
to see it finished, but there were trash cans down
Mhm.
around the pyramid and
Uh.
and stuff like
It's
that.
real modern, like
Yeah.
it is now.
Apparently the Sphinx, this pertained to that very early period, and it was to represent, they were dealing, remember, with a half animal, half human, so it was part of that. It was part to show what had happened, and, it had the face of a man, the hair of a woman, the body of the lion or whatever, and it was to integrate all of that.
You just
And-
couldn't make up their mind. What
Well,
they
the
wanted to
Sphinx
do.
originally has the like the goatee on it.
The
Yeah.
the ruler's
The ruler's
the ruler's
goatee.
beard, which
And-
women pharaohs wore too sometimes.
Right.
It was just a mark of.
And
yeah.
the particular ones at Garza, in World War I or World War II or whatever, the Germans were in there, whatever, and they shot off the nose and all that area.
Oh, is that what that is?
Yeah, well, it was all shot. They used them for target practice.
Great.
And the pyramids.
You know what
and
their
all that
karma's
we-
going to be? Working on the nose. and the ears.
But see, you were talking about one time about things.
Mhm.
Someone said about things being hidden in the Sphinx or the.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's.
Yeah, beneath the left
Yeah,
paw.
there's another picture that I'm going to be doing
Mhm.
in the future of the Sphinx on the side where you can see the claws, and they're going to be redoing all of these. They're slowly redoing all the temples.
Maybe this will be. I do want to share a prophecy because someone in this room might fulfill it. It's never been fulfilled yet. And Edgar Cayce said that 3 persons of peace, or 2 persons and a guide, who had past lives in this time, will quite easily. And I think it's in an afternoon around 4:30, and it's when I can if you want to go there, but it's like it's a certain sun coming down between the paws of the Sphinx. There's a hidden chamber, I think, beneath the left paw or to the front of the left paw. And apparently there are some psychic guardians that were put into place over this. But when these people come, and are right for this, it will happen. And apparently it may not be the result of tremendous digging. So maybe someone in this room will know someone or make that happen. And he said that it's supposed to happen before 1998 because it contains the records, not only prophecy of what's going to happen to us right up to in this last part of the century. And it also contains the records of all the Atlantean ages before, and the things that we've been talking about are written in the stone chamber. So,
And you can imagine how many generations of people have tried to find that.
That's right, I
And
know.
it's
Well, I
not
heard
time. Not
Sam
time.
Holland, I think, spoke about it once,
Right.
and he said that we can't because we haven't,
It's not time.
we can't see it yet.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't spiritually aware enough to
looking right
see
at
it.
it and not
Yeah,
seeing
yeah,
it right
yeah.
underneath our nose.
if anyone I knew, Sam Holland, who was initially, and Joe and I can verify this, Sam Holland was Joe's boss's boss, and some years ago he wasn't consciously in metaphysics at all. And he came to meet Jessica and Jerry, and it was through his first investigation of that teaching that he became, and recognizing all his own past lives, that he began the search. And of course now he teaches in different areas himself of metaphysics. But he had, I thought maybe it would be his group because they've had the money and the means and the drive to do it. But it hasn't, I guess, happened yet. So it could be, who knows?
Well, I know Jim Hertek from the Keys of Enoch has done a number of energy things there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're pretty powerful.
Could someone bring a shovel?
Waiting for it to levitate up.
Were the pyramids more or less likely to cover up the mysteries?
Yeah,
Like a cover up, a real cover up?
to embed them in the stone and I think the empty tomb, I'm not Egyptologist, is really to represent the reality of reincarnation, that there really is no death.
I mean, do you think, what would you do if they stood up on end? They all stood the other way, the point on the bottom?
I don't
all the
know.
stuff on the top.
Oh, I thought Casey said that the
Do you want
the
to see?
position
No,
of
but it's gotta be
the
yeah.
the position of the stars in relation to the point of the pyramid has to
That's
do
very
with the way a soul comes in or something. I think
That sounds sensible. That there.
the inner chambers and the way that they all relate to each other have to do with the soul's path, and
Mm-hmm.
it's beyond. We're
Yeah.
not ready to comprehend it right now.
And also, how do we get out of this plane? How do we become spiritually mastered? And I think that supposedly Jesus came back, and when he was Jesus in his last years, went back and had to spend time in the Great Pyramid and going through this initiation, and he was able to break through it. But it's symbolic of the initiation every soul has to pass through. Is that kind of what you read too?
The temples themselves, when I draw them, are easier to draw, lay out upside down. When I lay a
That's
set of
interesting.
temples out, I lay them out upside down.
Interesting. That might be
Well, I thought it was just because I was dyslexic, but
No, I
you know,
was
it's
wondering
like
because,
I do lay them out
inside.
upside
Yeah.
down because they balance. I can't get them balanced the other way.
It does give you a different
Yeah.
feeling about
It sure does.
Almost as if it's buried, hidden subconscious
Well, that's
energy.
what's going on with us. So yeah, I mean, it has to fall out or come
Definitely.
out later on through
Well,
study.
actually, the recent readings that I did is Jesus went back and studied with a a Hindu saint called Babaji.
Also that
the original Krishna, who now still supposedly exists.
He's
And
supposed to
the
have gone in he
yeah.
reviewed many of his own mystery past
Yeah.
lives
And
in
the
the last year.
initiation supposedly went through the Babaji of Krishna.
There are different views, but
Yeah.
certainly that he did go to
Uh-huh.
India and he tried
Yeah.
to he had to kind of journey. He we'll get into that in the Essenes. He had a woman teacher, Judith, according to Cayce, who was also, her parents were told that they were going to have a special child. And that had now become an era where women had virtually no freedom, but when she was born and she was a woman, they decided not to, a girl, to dispute it. And she apparently taught Jesus in his early years and in and through some of the time of the last years, where he had to go back to the time of Krishna, to the time of Hermes, and make a symbolic journey tuning back into all of this. Lisa, you've done a lot of reading with Cayce. Did you have anything to add or feelings or anything like that?
Not really. I have a lot of feelings that I can't talk about in words. They're more in thoughts and in pictures. So I've been reading the books for a long time and had readings about Atlantis. And the thing is that that's where everybody came from. That's why we all remember it. You know, Atlantis and Egypt and Greece, and so we're all from there. And, it's
I
interesting.
wonder it feels good, or bad. One or the other.
I think this necklace is Nephthys, I think, who is associated with the sky. Correct me if I'm wrong, but oftentimes there's a stone in the real fancy ones that she holds.
Well, looking at the pyramid like that is though you're seeing it from the sky.
Yeah.
You're seeing it from the air.
That's interesting.
You could look at it like
Mhm.
that. There's supposed to be pyramids on Mars.
Yeah, the surface they've been able to shoot so far, it
Mm.
does look like there are pyramids on Mars.
Interesting.
So there might be a connection.
Did you
And-
know we have a pyramid along the Mississippi River
Really?
in Kentucky?
Well, they're all over.
Yeah.
They haven't done
Oh,
it
really?
in
The only
South
reason, it was on the
America.
news about 4 weeks ago, and the only reason that they even brought it up is because the river would happen to be rising, and this old pyramid that's overgrown, and
Where do they say it's from? Indians?
well, they said it's built just like the Mayan pyramids, and it's overgrown with all these
Oh.
foliage and
Yeah.
everything. It's there. It's out of stone.
Which is where
Yeah.
it's mostly the Mississippi divided up this continent and those
Yeah.
Atlantean lands. That was a
Well,
division.
There were two types of
Yeah.
pyramids.
Uh-huh.
Okay, there were the ones
they're-
that the ones like this, that's smooth, and then the second type that was built, and then on the other side of Garza, and the three Garzas, there's 7 smaller pyramids that surround that. Now there's 2 from other kings or whatever, and the huge king that you were talking about, yeah, they're called the step pyramids.
Mm-hmm.
The
Which
huge
are like
misshapen pharaoh.
Oh, Akhenaten.
Okay, he had this like gargantuous shape that everybody thought. This is what I just recently read, that he was like some kind of really cruel kind of guy.
Mm.
And in many ways he was. In some ways he wasn't. But he was an architect and also, and he was the one who designed these stepped pyramids that you also see down in Mexico and in South America
And in China.
and in China. Yeah.
Yeah, there's supposed to be some in Tibet that
Yeah.
were destroyed.
But the originals are more like that. And then there's somewhere I understand that the outside of these pyramids at some point, way back, the original ones, even before these guys, were covered with gold.
I was going to say that I have very strong feelings of telepathic communication, which I think gives me the problem of not being able to share a lot of things.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of things written down
Mm-hmm.
in the past reading that we had, which covered a lot of the Egyptian and Atlantean times, and the time of Hermes and Rata, and at that time. But for some reason, it does seem to have a problem now because I can't. It's not come flowing out. It's in my mind.
Much as Edgar Cayce sometimes had that problem.
Tower of Babel.
Oh, that's
Just like
interesting.
that.
We went over that last week. I forgot
Yeah,
to put in.
we missed this last week when we were talking
Yeah.
about the Tower of Babylon. Excuse me for holding in one spot, but Joe's getting a picture of it.
Think how it fit in. I can't.
Well, I think they
Mm.
felt that it was the basic structures of the earlier pyramids before
Might have been.
the pyramid turbans.
We're going to touch more on, I think our next week is, I know we're doing Palestine, so some of the Old
Yeah.
Testament and Palestine, what were the key lives and so forth, and I think then after
Bring your
that will be
staffs
Greece.
and your robes.
The what?
Sheep and.
Yeah.
Staffs.
I'm not sure it was so fun to be a woman then with Moses.
Yes.
I do not want to remember that too clearly, I always find myself thinking, if you had to go in the desert, what would you take if you couldn't choose much? I think, where did I get that idea? But it's interesting to see how Moses has built up a lot of anger already. When he and Aaron weren't too nice to women, and some of the real strongly Hebrew regulations that didn't help women out a lot were instituted by someone who just came over from being Akhenaten. So keep that in mind.
Well, it's also interesting, neither was Paul. He didn't like women much either.
No, he did not.
In fact, some things say that he had even raped as a young man.
I believe that.
He was very angry towards women.
I believe that. Well, even now they're finding with Freud, who he came up with all his theories about the Oedipal complex and and children's desire. He had these women who were hysterical, and they said they'd been abused as children. And at first he believed them, and there's documentation to show that he did. And then, and somehow it had come out that an uncle of his might have done this, and then to deny that had existed, he said they were hysterical and they wanted to do this. They wanted to, be raped by these perpetrators, and so he made a whole theory of psychology that is now being debunked, part of it, because there were truly abused children, and he made it so extremely into the wishes of the abused that it became distorted. So a lot of that is being revised in our thinking, hopefully. Well, Bella Abzug, the politician that Shirley MacLaine liked so much, she wrote, or Joe heard her on the radio, and she said that Sigmund Freud set women back 1,000 years. And there's one feminist author who calls him Sigmund Fraud. And I'm not saying that, I'm sure he had some points, everyone does, but it's interesting because he developed the theory of projection, that we project out on others what we can't face. And I think there was a lot of that in Freud, and maybe he was okay when he came to analyzing himself, but he projected on women the things he can't face. They all envied men, they wanted to have their anatomy, they wanted to be them. And who knows what Freud was really dealing with inside himself. So I think a lot of that has been pretty well debunked.
Maybe
in terms
he
of
was
women.
that king who wanted to be a sister who went over to actors and love his brother.
Yeah, right. It sounds like, because Freud was, and Freud's grandson or great grandson is interesting. He's a painter in New York, but the only picture he paints is his mother, and he's like 50 years old. So it seems to be a family pattern, and maybe not everyone is quite as in love with their mother as Freud, but this was Freud's pattern, and it may have been, projected a little bit. I'm sure there are points of truth.
Well, should we take a break and then we'll come back and go on our journey?
Yes, we have a lot of a framework of where we might go.
Yeah, we can play.
Oh, thanks.
I'm going to leave the box for the $10 donation on the front here during the break for everybody.
If we want to make a check, we can make a check.
Well, either one of us, we'll just divide them up. So either you can make them for me, Lynn Rogers, or Alexi MacKinnon. As long as we get equal numbers, it's fine. We're going to do our last of a trilogy of workshops. Alexi will be there videotaping away, and Joe will be there. And this is it's the end of a series that I shared with the psychologist, Dr. Larry Rouse, who brings his own unique viewpoint on psychology. And we're going to talk about psychic ability, and he's going to talk about some of the things that all the various psychologists have said, the kinds of things that can shadow or get in the way of us being able to really see clearly psychically. And like things like Freud said, like reaction formation, parallel shadows, which is one of his new discoveries, self-deception. And then after that, after we really clear away some of those shadows, he's got an exercise to help in doing that. Then we're going to move into some of the teachings on safe psychic development using a spiritual ideal as protection, and actually do a lot of hands-on things where you can try a psychic tool like aura reading, or discover whether numerology is your psychic tool, maybe something that you learned in the Temple Beautiful. So if anyone's interested, and people seem to be, it's coming up next Saturday. So I want to let you know. And it's $25 if you pre-register, and if you're thinking about it and want to do that later on this evening, you can do that with Joe or whatever. So anybody have any questions on this commercial? That's how we let people know about other things, is while we're doing something. So.
Real paper? Whoops, not that one. Does anybody want to take a pill and
Oh, yeah.
get comfy, or?
That workshop is next Saturday, 1 to 5 or 5 to 6, and we do readings at the end for everybody.
Yeah, I think it would be a good idea.
You wouldn't know what's interesting about that reading too, that Lexi did that time, is my mother-in-law now, who's now closest to me as my mother, who's raising my son, who is the mother of the father, was the midwife who attended the birth. It's like,
Yeah, it does.
Mother of the father.
huh?
Wow.
Your chair?
Are you gonna want it?
Yeah, I'm gonna, I know, somewhere around here, I don't know if that light's gonna be on.
Yeah, that light is.
You can take your shoes off if you'd like to be more comfortable. Joe, is that light gonna be on?
No, not at all.
Okay. Are we being videotaped now? Sort of.
Yeah, but-
Yeah. Turn down to.
Sorry.
Oh my God.
Wait a minute, I got all these pillows, darn it.
Wait,
I want one. Okay, go for it. Oh,
I might go to sleep tonight. Feels like my sinus allergies.
Hmm?
Yeah, I can't remember. 15 minutes at least. 20 minutes at least. Rita was
I wasn't here last week. I was homesick.
about 20 minutes anyway.
Anybody want another one?
I think it depends.
I'll go to sleep. Go down.
There. Wait until the rest of the game comes.
I've been waiting to do this all day.
Where's the rest of the game?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's.
Bless you, my
thank
child.
you. Always, always.
It has been nagging me.
Just gonna say it.
So you can write down what you get.
Back to sit there. I don't wanna step on your feet.
Yeah,
It's okay.
Yeah, no, Alexi, why hang on? Release him. She says, do we release him too? I says, yeah, why hang on to him? Release him. Lexi knows how to do that.
Absolutely. We have to wait for the rest of the passengers.
Paper?
Oh, yeah.
You get to go, Joe, huh? You get to go also.
There's
That's
something
nice.
on this floor. My sinuses and my allergies don't work.
Yeah.
Getting you right here.
Yeah, I get
Hey,
a
maybe
little
maybe
stuff.
we're already getting reaction to being put in tubes. You know,
Put what?
feet. It's my feet I don't like. I
No,
said,
your feet are together.
our feet are together.
They'll cross later enough.
No crossing the legs, please. Even at the ankles. There's a, okay. Everybody get very comfortable.
I am right by the speaker. I'm not sure that's good. That's a brilliant idea.
Yes.
You said all born, and we think that 1960s song, Trip. Is that? Never mind. Go back to sleep. You know that dance we used to do? Okay. I just don't want to go down in the pyramid and honor to the queen. These are handmade.
Okay, you ready?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure that we are. Let me say that there. I'd like to stand in front of the camera. Okay, everybody take a very deep breath. And then pull in all that positive energy that's all around us. And exhaling any stress, any blocks, or any tension in the body. Take another very deep, deep breath. This time, beginning to see a beautiful golden orange sun. You're becoming consumed by the energy of this beautiful sun, bringing with it loving energy. And exhaling, allowing your body to begin to relax and release any more stress or tension still remaining. In your mind's eye, you can see that beautiful golden orange sun completely engulfing this room. And each of us are now becoming part of the energy of that beautiful golden orange sun, as it is now beginning to evaporate into the atmosphere of the universe and taking each of us with it, going higher and higher, faster and faster. And you realize that there is no time. There's only thought that can take you any place you choose. And as you become one with the energy of the sun, you become also very aware of the soul memories that are now going to allow you to revisit the energy of Egypt and allowing you to become very aware at what part you took in that lifetime there. As that sun begins to rise over the mountaintops, you also realize that you are now at a window, or a doorway, or an archway, and you're watching the sun rise in the early, early morning, feeling the rays of the sun all about you, knowing with it brings a very, very special energy, one with the wholeness of the universe. And you feel so totally and completely relaxed, so very spiritually intact as you watch the sun rise. You can feel the energy of the sun bringing a special, loving joy to your day, knowing that at this point you can walk away from the area that you're watching the sun. As you turn around, you begin to see where you have been standing. You're noticing all that is around you at this very point in time. As you do so, you see each little detail that is around you. You notice the walls. Perhaps you might be outside. Notice your environment. You can smell the different fragrances in the air. Feels so very familiar. As you do so, you look at your feet. And you become very aware that what is upon them. And now, as you touch the garment you're wearing, you feel its texture, the quality of the material. Or perhaps it might be something other than material. And once again, it feels so very familiar. You can see the colors that are arranged in the material. And note if there's a design. As you watch your hand holding the material for your garment, you can see whether it's a smooth, textured skin, its color, or perhaps it might be a little more rugged. Look very carefully, for you also notice that there's something very special that you are wearing on your hand. As you turn to your left, there's a very shiny object there. Now you can see every detail of your face, its structure, the color of your eyes, your skin, the color of your hair. And perhaps there's something upon your head. As you gaze at your own facial structure, you hear someone calling your name. For this is a very special day, and it is only the sunrise. And you are very excited for this great preparation taking place right now. And as this person comes to you, the one who called your name, see what this person looks like. Notice every detail. And now as you continue to prepare for your day, you know in your heart what it is that you must do today. You feel a little discontent, but joy at the same time. You look inside in your heart and see what is taking place, why you should be experiencing both these feelings. And now you begin to walk through the area you're in. There's a lovely garden just on the other side from where you're located. As you walk and begin to enter the garden, there's someone very special sitting upon a stoned area there. I want you to go over and speak to that person and know who that person is in your present life at this very moment in time. And as you two speak, you become aware of chanting, with the priest and priestess are also beginning their day. And there's something that you must speak to one of them about. So you find that you're on your way to the temple. And someone asks you where it is that you are going, and you tell them which temple. this person is joining you. And you're getting closer and closer to the temple. There is much being done inside. As you enter, you feel the familiarity. And look around, where you have a very special hiding place in the temple that you remember as a child. Go to that place now. There's something there which you had loved when you were a small child, and you remember where it's located. I want you to pick it up and take it with you. You can feel now the sun is overhead. It's almost high noon in the skies. And you know that you must continue to prepare. So you must speak to one of the people in the temple as to what your part will be in this ceremony. And I want you to ask this person a great explanation as to why this must take place. And know how you feel inside. At your response to this reason. And now it's time. So you must go to the place that you are to be situated in. And as you do so, know it has been your soul's choice for this the part that you take in this event, in this ceremony. And as this takes place, if you have feelings that you need to heal right now, I want you to do that through the divine source of energy. I want you to release and let go of those energies. To let go of anything that you care no longer to carry with you. For this has been a key time, and one you choose no longer, of your own free will, to carry on. But if your soul's purpose, it does choose this, then allow it to be so, and know that you have that choice. And now I want you to journey to the place that you must, with the guide and the spiritual teacher that is waiting for you. you go to that place only you can go. Know the full purpose and reason for the journey you just took. This time, should it be necessary, a complete forgiveness, blessing, and love sent to yourself and to all those that it is indeed necessary for you in your soul's growth and purpose at this present moment. So take this time right now to release and let go. And now, you speak with your guide and your spiritual teacher. They are both or all going to give you something very special. Know what it is and what it means to you as it is given. Begin to feel at one once again with the beautiful golden orange sun as it sets into the beautiful magenta and pink golden skies. And feel your energy being drawn right into it once again, allowing your soul to feel the vibration of the beauty of the energy of the sun. As you do this, you come back with a beautiful new understanding of your soul's purpose and how, if you choose, can go into a higher growth pattern for yourself as you venture through the universe once again with that wonderful energy of the sun, the vitality, the beautiful electric feeling within that the sun gives one. And you feel yourself so high, so beautifully in the beautiful, magnificent universe. And as you wander in the energy patterns of the sun, you see you have become now a sunbeam, headed directly back for the physical body that you are. And you can feel yourself rejoining the physical being that you are, and allowing yourself to take a very deep breath and bringing back a new energy and a new understanding of who you are, and exhaling, feeling at one with your own physical body in harmony, in balance, healing. You can feel the wonderful healing that has taken place for yourself. And allow yourself another deep breath and allow your hand chakras to close. Move your ankles about. And one more deep breath so you can be completely and fully back in the here and now. And allow yourself to come back at your own pace, feeling the energy of love that you have brought back with you. And now take this moment, if you choose, to make note of your journey.